My name's Jonathan Clark. I did a Bachelor of Science majoring in zoology and parasitology, and then I did my honours in that field. I worked in that area for over 5 years, including in Borneo on malaria research. I then went back and I did a physiotherapy degree. I did a Christian diploma in there somewhere at one stage. And so I've written some papers in international journals in my work as a physiotherapist. And I've written a book, so Echoes of Jesus. It's a brilliant book, It's my favourite. So I will talk about that next week, I hope. What's in store for the rest of tonight? I'm going to speak for a bit, and then we'll have a Q&A and then a proper interval after that. I'm going to speak on one topic, and then after that we'll speak on possibly the biological evidence about the difference between men and women's brains. What evidence is biology using now to talk about the differences that should exist between male and female? What does Islam say about the genders, and what does Buddhism say? I think most of that will end up next week, but we'll see how we go. So one of the topic that I'm talking about is related to the flip side of what Christina said. So many people think that Christianity is the worst thing that happened to the world as far as women's status is concerned. And they say that if there was no Christianity for the last so many hundreds of years especially, the world would have been a better place. Well, what would have been the religion in the West if it wasn't for Christianity? It probably would have been evolutionism. Now, evolutionists, like Richard Dawkins, are very good at pointing the finger. He wrote a book called The God Delusion, and in that he didn't say Christianity was misogynist, he said the God of the Bible is misogynist. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see what does the evolutionists think about women, and what have they thought? I'm referring to evolutionism because evolutionism is a belief in evolution, so that is a religion. So Professor Michael Roos, who was a professor of history and philosophy at the Florida State University. He got 3 honorary PhDs and an honorary Doctor of Science. He wrote copiously. It was his words, as an evolutionist, who said that evolution is a religion. It was true of evolution from the beginning. It is true of evolution today. And that's coming from someone who considers himself an ex-Christian. Professor Ninian Smart, he was a professor of comparative religion. I think we're still on. Professor of comparative religion at the University of California. Unfortunately, he's dead now. And he gave a way of defining what is a religion. He talked about 7 different domains. And we've talked about them in the past and shown how evolutionism, or the belief in evolution, is actually a religion. So when I use that term, now you know why. A little bit of a backdrop, because what I'm going to do is mostly concentrate on some of the big influences on the 1800s, which then affected everything since. 1800s was a really important time. So what was it like for women in the 1800s in general? As far as I know, there was no country where women could vote in politics at any level of any significance. In Prussia, that's a country that's not around anymore, but in Prussia in 1850 they passed a law, and that law meant that women could not participate in public meetings or political associations that had anything to do with public life. And that stayed from 1850 to 1908. So it's pretty amazing. You can learn a lot more about the difficult life women had in the 1800s, but I just thought I'd give you a bit of a backdrop. We're going to be talking about some countries that you might not think of as being so particularly influential, but they were very influential back then. So back in 1814, diplomats got together and they talked about the 5 great powers. And the 5 great powers were France, Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria. Now, Prussia in 1871 became really part of the German Empire. So they were the 5 great powers. So you'll see me making reference to those countries just so you can see how widespread and influential some of these views were. America and Japan apparently didn't become regarded as any of the great powers to about 1905. So much time had passed. So evolution before Darwin is something that not everybody is aware of. Evolutionism is a very old religion. Now, Darwin is often credited with getting it going in 1859 with the launch of his book. But there were people believing in evolution before Darwin. So there was a guy called Denis Diderot. He was a Frenchman. He was quite a strong atheist, quite a missionary for atheism, and he was an encyclopedist. So that was his role in life. And so he said back in 1754 that every living thing came from a common ancestor. So that's over 100 years earlier than Darwin's book, 1859. So you can start to get the idea that some of the beliefs that Darwin put forward in his book, they've been around for a long time, influencing people in big ways. When you think about it, what was he saying about everything has a common ancestor? Well, that's basically saying there was some common organism, perhaps an amoeba, a one-celled animal, that eventually became an Airedale Terrier. It's like saying an amoeba, a one-celled animal, eventually became an ape, which eventually became an astronaut. So this is the big picture of evolution. Many people don't realise how profound and imaginative this belief system is. Arno Penzias, he was a guy who co-won a Nobel Prize for Physics in 1978. He said, nothing that exists now was around before the Big Bang. So evolution believes that there was nothing to start with. And most evolutionists say that, and nothing by itself became everything. So that's the belief system. It's not what we witness today. There's nothing that science can prove today. It's a religion. So that was Denis Diderot, way before Darwin. There was JeanBaptiste Lamarck. I always find this really sad, you know. His name means John the Baptist. And now he wrote in 18... Now, who was he? He was an invertebrate zoologist and a botanist. He was quite a famous guy. So when I was at university, Lamarck was often talked about. And JeanBaptiste Lamarck said that it was apes that became men. In fact, he seemed to have had the idea that different types of apes became different races of men. And of course, the Negroes were closer to the original apes than the whites. He happened to be French and white, of course. Yeah. So these ideas about different races being more evolved than others, they go back a long time. So now we come to look at, well, what have these evolutionists said about the role of women? So Emile Heskey, so he was an anatomist and an anthropologist. He was a German. And he said in 1854 that the Negro spinal cord was of the same type as that found in women and children and was approaching the type of the ape. Now, of course, that's not a nice thing to say about Negroes, but it's certainly not a nice thing to say about women and their spinal cord, is it? So he said that way back in 1854. In 1855, we're looking at an English character. Herbert Spencer is when he wrote in 1855. Who was he? He was an amazing guy. He's been regarded as an astronomer and an anthropologist, as a biologist, as a civil engineer, as an economist, as a philosopher, as a political theorist, as a psychologist, as a sociologist. It just goes on and on. He's quite amazing. 3 Supreme Court judges said they were Spencerians. They were followers of his. He sold over 1 million copies of his books in his lifetime. Now, when are we talking? 1850s. That's pretty impressive. And he was the inventor of the paperclip. So many of us are very thankful for Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer co-wrote a book called The Psychology of the Sexes. So this is before Charles Darwin's book. But what was he saying? He said that evolutionary energy was funneled so that women had less physical and mental abilities, and rather the energy went into increasing their reproductive abilities. So they're actually less evolved. They weren't so much the weaker sex, they were the weaker man. It's quite interesting, isn't it? He said as a consequence of this, they had less intelligence, less intellectual and emotional faculties. They had a decreased ability to have abstract reasoning and to comprehend. Fairly strong comments, but all based on evolutionary ideas that were quite prevalent at the time. Interestingly enough, he was never married. So I don't know why. Yeah. So he's 1855. The next fellow that we're going to talk about is Charles Darwin. Now, he was an Englishman. Now, Darwin was quite the materialist. So way back in 1838, about 21 years before he launched his book, he'd already decided that our ability to think was just like our ability to sweat. Thought, in his words, thought was just a secretion of the brain. I think that's pretty well the definition of a materialist. Not the idea of today where a materialist is someone who just buys, but a materialist is someone who thinks that all that exists is atoms and chemistry and the laws of physics. So that's what he was like way back in 1838. In 1859, he launched his book, The Origin of the Species. He wrote a lot of letters and he left a lot of notes, so we know a lot about what else he thought and said. In 1860, he said a really surprising comment to me, because I've always been enamoured by these birds. He said, "The peacock's tail, every time I gaze at it, makes me sick." Why did he say that? Because he's having trouble trying to work out how could a creature of such beauty evolve. Because what's evolution about? What drives it? It's survival of the fittest. Do you know who came to originate that term? Survival of the fittest came from Herbert Spencer, who we talked about before. He coined the term in 1864, and Darwin then took it over. But the idea was always there, that you developed horns, or you developed strong teeth, or you developed the ability to fly or do other things because you were developing abilities to outcompete, to outkill the other species. And that's what evolution is all about, typically. So he was struggling to find out, well, why does this creature with this amazing tail exist? Because that's not going to help you. That's the male. The females don't look like that, of course. The females look rather boring, as is often in the case in the animal world. It's interesting God's sense of humour that he reversed it for men and women, didn't he? Yeah. I don't know of any other species, apart from humans, that it's a female that looks better. And even the females know that. Yeah. So this peacock's tail was a conundrum. So in 1871 he released a book, and it was called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And he thought he'd solved the problem. That basically what happened is that the genes, it's all about the genes, not really about the animals. The genes want to have their genes in the next generation. And so a male's trying to make sure, this is personifying, it's terrible, but the males are trying to make sure its genes are going to go on to the next generation, so it wants to mate lots. So it develops something that attracts the female a bit more, just as a random chance. Of course, it doesn't think. So some random mutation happens to make the male, this particular one male bird, look more attractive. So the females allow it to mate more, so it breeds more, and therefore there's more of that gene, and then supposedly later on another gene is mutated or is formed in another male bird, and that one happens to make it a little bit more attractive again, and so once again all the females flock to it, it gets to breed more. And so supposedly the attractions to the females are so strong and result in this male or this male type being so successful at breeding that it outweighs the fact that it can't run away from foxes anymore. So he thought he had solved it. Takahashi is a Japanese guy. We're just a little diversion here. I think it's really important though. Takahashi was a Japanese researcher. So in 2008 he released the results of 7 years worth of watching peacocks mate in the wild. That's a long time. He watched 268 matings of birds, peacocks, peahens. That's what the female's called. And he noted how many eyes those peacocks had that were able to successfully mate, and the other ones, and how long the tails were. And obviously, what was he expecting? He was expecting that the males that had the longer tail feathers and the greater number of eyes, you know, the eyes and the feathers, would have higher progeny. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be the case. So much for Darwin's theory. Anyway, Darwin wrote this book called The Descent of Man. And in that, he let loose about what he really thought about women. And And Bill is kind enough to read you a quote. And I'll just turn this off so it doesn't interfere.
Testing. Yep. So this isn't my words, right? Here I am quoting Darwin. So save the tomatoes for Darwin. This is what he said. Man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius. Man is the rival of other men. He delights in competition, and this leads to ambition, which passes too easily into selfishness. These latter qualities seem to be his natural and unfortunate birthright. It's generally admitted that with woman, the powers of intuition, of rapid perception, and perhaps of imitation are more strongly marked than in man. But some, at least, of these faculties are characteristic of the lower races and therefore of a past and lower state of civilization. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. We may also infer that if men are capable of a decided preeminence over woman in many subjects, the average of mental power in man must be above that of woman. Here end of the quote.
So as Bill said, they're not his words. He's happily married. They're Charles Darwin's words. You've got to understand too that Charles Darwin was thinking not just about evolution in terms of making the man stronger, but to be better at fighting off the other men trying to steal his woman, trying to do better than the leader that's already got a lot of women, and trying to do better than the animals that are trying to take his women. He had to be able to invent weapons. He had to be able to outsmart and out-strategize. So that all played into this idea that not just the man's body, but the man's mind was far and superior to that of the woman. And so this is where evolution leads you, or has led people. Now, Charles Darwin has been regarded as the greatest influence on the modern world. And that's according to a guy called Ernst Mayr, who wrote that in the Scientific American magazine. Who's Ernst Mayr? Well, he's regarded as the greatest biologist of the 1900s. Quite a famous guy. He was an ornithologist, a bird lover, in fact, originally, a taxonomist as well. It's interesting how much he praises Charles Darwin's influence, because strangely enough, Ernst Mayr is often called the second Darwin. So maybe he's got alternate reasons for thinking that Charles Darwin is so good. Let's move on from Charles Darwin now. Let's go back into France. So there was a guy called Pierre Paul Broca. Some of you who know about the brain and speech might have learnt about Paul Broca because he came up with some great discoveries. Who was he? Well, he was a doctor, an anatomist, a neurologist, and an anthropologist. He was quite a clever man. In 1861, he released the results of some studies. He'd autopsied 300 male brains, almost 300, just a little short. And he also had autopsied over 150 female brains. And then he weighed them. And he noticed that the difference in weight between the male and the female was 14% of the male's weight. And it was a female that had the smaller brain size. That's what he found out in 1861. Now, he said that, well, maybe some of that's related to the fact that women are smaller. But he also said that everyone knows that women's intellect is less, so it must be at least partly to do with the fact that they're less intelligent, that there's this difference in brain size, which is quite circular reasoning, because the whole purpose of the experiment was to show that there's a difference in the brain size and that may be related to intelligence. So that was what he did in 1861. In 1873, he did another study, this time on some caves called La Homme Morte in France, Dead Man's Cave. And there were 7 skulls belonging to males and 6 relating to females of these creatures that were regarded as much less evolved humans. And he measured the brain sizes of the skulls of the 7 males and the 6 females. And he noticed that the difference in brain size back then was actually less than the difference in the difference in skull size, therefore brain size back then, was less than the difference in the weights of the brains now. So in other words, as evolution is progressing, the women's brain is actually getting even more disadvantage to the male's brain. So once again, it was good news for all the men, wasn't it? And this was in the name of evolution. So therefore, they had strong reasons for saying that the women were less intelligent. Now, a guy called Charles Darwin from the University of Melbourne pointed out this wasn't just sour grapes for women. He pointed out that Broca's School of Anthropology, that's basically what he started, the School of Anthropology in France, in Paris, that they were all about trying to foster onto the Republican worldview a materialistic and atheistic view of the world. They wanted the Republican movement in France to have a very atheistic, materialistic worldview, so they wanted to prove that intelligence was related to brain size. Because if it is, then is there a spiritual world, or is it all just chemicals? So you can understand why these guys were so keen on establishing that women are less intelligent because their brains are less big. And later on in the night, if we get time, we'll talk about, well, what are the differences between men and women's brains, if you like. So that was Pierre Paul Broca in 1873. It wasn't long after that that one of his so-called ardent disciples, Gustave Le Bon, also wrote. That was 1879, a Frenchman, as I said, Gustave Le Bon. Now, who was he? He was called a doctor and a polymath. A polymath was just someone like Herbert Spencer. They just seemed to know about everything there was to know. He seemed to have influenced a lot of people. It's said that he influenced Roosevelt, Mussolini, the great inverted commas, Italian dictator, becomes socialist, and also Hitler. Gustave Le Bon was the founder of crowd psychology. It's now called social psychology. And he wrote some interesting words about what evolution teaches us about the differences between the sexes. And I've got a Frenchman coming up called Wilhelmine, and he's going to read you a quote from Gustave Le Bon. Not in French.
Sacre bleu. In the most intelligent races, as among the Parisians, there are now a large number of women whose brains are closer in size to those of gorillas than to the most developed male brains. This inferiority is so obvious that no one can contest it for a moment. Only its degree is worth discussion. All psychologists who have studied the intelligence of women, as well as poets and novelists, regard today that they represent the most inferior forms of human evolution and that they are closer to children and savages than to an adult, civilized man. They excel in fickleness, inconstancy, absence of thought and logic, incapacity to reason. Without doubt, there exist some distinguished women very superior to the average man, but they are as exceptional as the birth of any monstrosity, as, for example, of a gorilla with 2 heads. Consequently, we may neglect them entirely. A desire to give them the same education and, as a consequence, to propose the same goals for them is a dangerous, wild fantasy. The day when, misunderstanding the inferior occupations which nature has given her, women leave the home and take part in our battles, on this day, a social revolution will begin, and everything that maintains the sacred ties of the family will disappear. End of the quote.
I think that's very much worth a clap, Bill. That was a great French accent. Very good. So where did he write that? Was it in some obscure place? Was it a letter to a friend? It was 1879, and it was in the most important journal of anthropology perhaps in the world, certainly in France. It was the Journal of Anthropology in France. So this was a published peer review type thing. I think they had peer review back then, maybe not. And so anyway, but it was widely influential. So that's 1879 with Pierre, Gustave Le Bon. So let's move to another part of the world, another one of the 5 great powers. So in Austria, there's a fellow called Sigmund Shlomo Freud. So he was an Austrian psychoanalyst. Put your hand up if you've ever seen a movie that had a reference to Sigmund Freud in it in psychoanalysis. Yeah, there's quite a lot of them. who was Sigmund Shlomo Freud? So one writer wrote that the two seminal thinkers that most influenced Western thought were Marx and Freud. But of course other people would say, well, Marx and Freud were most influenced by Charles Darwin. So that's how big the influence, that they are regarded as the most seminal thinkers that have influenced the Western world's life and literature, to be more precise. Another guy talked about how Sigmund Shlomo Freud completely revolutionised the way the modern world thinks about mind and human behaviour. So Sigmund Freud wasn't just that psychoanalyst that we sometimes poke fun at. He was a very influential man. In 1881, he became a doctor. So this is just a year before Charles Darwin's death. Charles Darwin was actually born in 1809. So 1881, he became a doctor. In 1925, he wrote a book called The Psychological Consequences of the Anatomic Distinctions Between the Two Sexes. In 1926, he talked about, well, if he was to start up a school to teach the next generation of people the psychoanalysis that he developed, that evolution would be a very big part of that. In 1926, he wrote a book called The Future of an Illusion, just reinforcing what he had always said, that all religion is simply a result of evolution. So it's a struggle of trying to live in this rough world full of terrible nature that people have come up with the idea of religion. So he certainly wasn't a Christian fellow, was he? So that's 1926. So Sigmund Freud wrote some very interesting things, but you've got to understand where he's coming from. So he's looking at the different minds evolving differently because of their different anatomical body parts. And I'm not going to talk about his theories, they're quite embarrassing, but he did talk a lot about how things like guilt and other emotions were just evolved, but evolved differently because men and women had different evolutionary backgrounds, if you like. So he talked about how the superego of women evolved very differently to the superego of men, and that'd be quite an interesting conversation to have another night. But as a result of their superegos evolving differently to the superegos of men, what happened? Well, he said that the superego development of the woman resulted in them having a decreased sense of justice. And keep in mind that he did actually use a couch, by the way. So these women have a decreased sense of justice because of their superego evolving differently. They had a judgmental attitude that was much more reflective of their feelings, obviously, rather than rationality. They had a decreased ability to do, they had less ability to act appropriately when life produced urgent and great demands, which is quite a strong statement. As a result of this, he said that for men, it was very important that they maintain their conclusions regarding these poor character traits about women, despite the feminists trying to force us to consider the two sexes as completely equal in position and worth. End of quote. Needless to say, he was anti-women emancipation. Now, who did I say he was? He was a man who had great influence over the world, enormous influence. One of his associates was a Dr. Stikle, not Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Stikle. Some of you might later on want to call him Dr. Jekyll. The two of them, Freud and Stikle, used to go around giving lectures together until they fell apart in 1912. But in 1914, Dr. Stikle was so convinced about his superior understanding of women's sexuality and how it affects them in all domains, he was able to say that only those women who have unsatisfied libido take any interest at all in the suffragette movement, the movement to have women to vote. So that was the sort of lines of thinking that evolution produced, and it obviously bore fruit. How we measure that fruit, I'll leave it up to you, but just keep in mind how influential these men were. Keep in mind also that that's the 1900s, late 1800s. When did women get the vote in the UK federally? Not till 1928. When did they get the vote in France? 1945. I don't know of all the influences, but I do know that this evolutionary idea of the difference between the sexes, this atheistic evolutionism, this religion, had a profound impact. Is there anyone else out there in the world that agrees with me? Well, thankfully there is. There's a lady called Patricia Ferrara, and it's great that she's a lady. Who is she? She's from the University of Cambridge. She's a lecturer there in the history and philosophy of science, just like Michael Roos was in the Florida State University. And she wrote in 2015 about the influence of evolutionism. She didn't call it that, of course. Evolutionary ideas about the male and female and how it affected the women emancipation, in particular suffragettes. And what did she point out? She pointed out that evolution did teach that women were intellectually inferior, that it did teach that they were physically inferior, and that it also taught that they had a separate sphere of existence in the kitchen. It also taught something else that I hadn't uncovered in my research at this point, that there was another reason, a third or fourth reason, depending on how you add them up, about why women were thought that they must stay out of the higher domains of the workforce and political life. So this evolutionary idea was based on eugenics. So Charles Darwin had a cousin called Francis Galton, and he's the father of the eugenics movement. You know about eugenics. The negative eugenics is what Hitler was all about, of course, and lots of other people. And the idea was that if the society has different levels of women, and some women are clearly more bright than others, who would they be? Oh, they must be the successful ones, the ones who have more money, the ones who look better. All sorts of ways, I guess, you could look at that. And how dangerous it would be if all the brighter women ended up getting involved in politics and all this other stuff and had less children. Because then the breeding stock from the super good women is going to be less than the breeding stock from the poor women who don't have an education. And over time, that will result in a de-evolution, if you like, a decrease in the genetic fitness of the human race. Now, I didn't make that up. That was Patricia Ferrara pointing out this other consequence of evolutionism on the world. So I hope that helps you to see that Christianity was a strong counter-influence to this atheistic evolutionism that was around. We're going to have a short break very shortly. We're going to have a Q&A, and we'll have an interval. And after that, I'm going to talk about some examples of women that have changed the status of women because of Jesus. So you know that what Christine was saying about Christian worldview, about the influence of Jesus as one to uphold the status of women, actually bore fruition, came to fruition. So thank you very much for your time. Enjoy some refreshments and stretching your legs. And there's some great books out there too. Bye.